Lecture 19, Memory Storage and Retrieval. So now let's assume that a memory trace is adequately encoded in memory, well elaborated and organized. Once encoded, that trace is, at least in principle, available for various uses. It remains activated so long as attention is devoted to it, that is, by rote maintenance rehearsal or whatever it is that maintains an item in short-term or working memory, and therefore has a high probability of being retrieved. But now the problem is that at some point the person is going to have to stop engaging in maintenance rehearsal. His or her attention is going to be directed elsewhere, and then at some later point is going to try to remember the thing that he encoded. So, first of all, what happens over the retention interval? And what happens over the retention interval is forgetting. When a memory is no longer the object of active attention, when it's no longer being actively rehearsed, it's going to start to fade. And there's going to be a lower probability of retrieval from long-term memory. And the probability of retrieval is going to progressively diminish over time. Now, this is just common sense. It's a common sense point that's obvious to anyone who's ever forgotten anything, but it was initially documented by Ebbinghaus in another of his pioneering studies of memory. In this study, Ebbinghaus used essentially the same method as in his study of rehearsal, learning by rote a list of nonsense syllables. After reaching a criterion of learning, he allowed an interval of time to pass, and then he measured his own memory by means of savings and relearning, the amount of time it would take him to relearn a list he had already memorized. In this study, the retention intervals were 20 minutes, an hour, almost 9 hours, a day, 2 days, 7 days, and so on. What you see here is a progressive forgetting, with memory loss increasing with the length of the retention interval. Ebbinghaus's finding illustrates what we'll call the time dependency principle in memory, which states simply that memory for an event is an inverse function, a negative function, of the length of the retention interval between storage and retrieval. Now, surprisingly enough, there are some exceptions to the time dependency principle. There are circumstances under which memory can increase as a function of the length of the retention interval in phenomena known as reminiscence or hypermnesia. But we're not going to be concerned with those phenomena in these lectures. We're going to focus on the basic time dependency principle that memory seems to fade with time and try to figure out why that is. To repeat, time dependency in memory is a common sense point. Everybody knows that memory gets worse with time. The real scientific problem lies in discovering what happens over the retention interval to produce time dependency. And theories of forgetting over the years have generally focused on 4 distinct possibilities. The first of these is that memory traces passively decay. The idea here is that without active rehearsal, memory simply fades over time, the way an echo fades in a building, or the way a photograph fades with exposure to the sun. Passive decay is a variant on Thorndike's law of exercise, the principle of use it or lose it. Unless the memory is rehearsed, it's simply lost from storage. Another possibility is that traces are displaced from storage by newly arriving memory traces. It's possible that newly encoded memories can kick out or erase old memories from storage in much the same way that recording a new message on a telephone answering machine erases previous messages. If you've got a file cabinet and you keep stuffing file folders in it, eventually it gets full. And the only way you can put a new file folder in is by taking some other file folder out. That's the general idea behind displacement. Another hypothesis about time dependency in memory refers to the possible disruption of consolidation after encoding. The decay and displacement hypotheses pretty much assume that the encoding of a new memory takes place instantaneously at the moment of perception. And then after the memory is encoded, Either it decays or it's kicked out by some newly arriving memory. But the consolidation theory assumes that the encoding of a new memory doesn't happen instantaneously at the moment of perception, but rather takes time. Not just seconds, but minutes, hours, days, weeks. Consolidation itself is time dependent under this theory, and anything that disrupts consolidation, anything that interrupts this time dependent process, is going to produce forgetting. The longer a memory has had to become consolidated, the less vulnerable it's going to be to this time-dependent process. But for some time after a memory has begun to be encoded, note that phrase, begun to be encoded, it remains liable to be lost if the consolidation process is somehow interrupted. And finally, there's the hypothesis that time-dependent forgetting is produced by interference among stored memory traces. Here, the idea is that nothing really happens to disrupt the encoding or consolidation or storage processes, but that new memories acquired over the retention interval somehow get in the way of old memories. Whereas the decay and displacement and consolidation theories of time-dependent forgetting interpret the phenomenon as a failure of encoding or a loss from storage, the interference theory basically says that time-dependent forgetting represents a failure of retrieval. The memories are still there, they haven't been lost from storage, but interference among memories makes it difficult to retrieve the memory that you're interested in, and that this interference builds up over time. And as it turns out, each of these hypotheses turns out to be correct, but each of the processes seems to apply to a different aspect of memory. For example, we've already seen that information is lost from the sensory registers, such as the icon and the echo, by means of passive decay. In the Sperling experiment, you can present an array of letters and then ask the subject to report just a subset of those letters, one row or the other. And if you make that request less than a second after the display has disappeared, subjects can do it pretty well. But if you make that request more than a second after the array has disappeared, they're very bad at it. In this case, the sensory representation of the array seems to have just disappeared. It's decayed. Displacement also occurs in the sensory registers. If you present the subject with one visual stimulus, and then within a second or so present the subject with another visual stimulus, the second stimulus will knock the first right out of sensory memory. This is the basis for a phenomenon known as masking that is often used in the study of so-called subliminal, or as I prefer to call it, implicit perception. It's not clear that short-term memory ever decays. If you stop a subject from rehearsing, but also prevent him or her from becoming distracted by something else, information in short-term memory might actually last for a pretty long period of time. It's just that that doesn't happen under ordinary circumstances. Remember the capacity of short-term memory, 7 plus or minus 2 items. Once you've got about 7 items, or 7 chunks in short-term memory, something's got to go if something else is going to come in. And if something else comes in, it comes in by virtue of kicking something out. And that's what displacement is all about. So decay and displacement seem to reflect processes of forgetting, time-dependent forgetting, in the sensory registers and in short-term memory. But we're not really interested in short-term memory in these lectures right now. We're interested in long-term memory, where decay and displacement just don't seem to be an issue. Rather, forgetting from long-term memory seems to be mediated sometimes by a consolidation failure, but most often by interference. The idea that some forgetting from long-term memory might be mediated by a kind of consolidation failure has its origins in the late 19th century with Rebos' Law of Regression, formulated on the basis of Rebos' clinical studies of amnesic patients even before Ebbinghaus published his pioneering experimental work. Examining brain-damaged patients suffering from various forms of amnesia, Rebos noticed a particular temporal progression. The first memories to be lost pertain to the most recent events experienced by the patient. More remote memories tended to be preserved until the disease progressed really badly. Memory for specific events, what we would call episodic memory, tended to be lost before memory for general ideas, what we would now call semantic memory. Rebos discovered that memory for emotional events, memory for feelings, took even longer to disappear, and memory for behaviors, what we might today call procedural memory, was the very last to go. But for our purposes, Rebos' important observation was that when patients suffered from amnesia, they were more likely to forget the most recent events that had happened to them, and memories for more remote events were more likely to persist. And that's exactly what we'd expect if consolidation of long-term memory is something that takes time. The more time a memory has had to consolidate, the less vulnerable it's going to be to disruption by some sort of amnesic process. Here's a graphic depiction of what you might call the normal temporal gradient in memory. If you ask people to remember various events in their lives, we find that they're more likely to remember the most recent events that have happened to them, and the farther in the past that the event occurred, the less likely they are to remember it, or by some other measure, the less well they're likely to remember it. You can try this for yourself. After this lecture, sit down with a piece of paper and give yourself half an hour just to write down everything that you remember from your entire life. Subjects have actually been asked to do this in experiments, and if you spend about half an hour at this and then you look over your list of events, you'll find that most of the things you remember come from the last couple of months or couple of years of your life. That's the temporal gradient in memory, and that's the time dependency principle in action. But what we see in many amnesic patients is quite different from this. Here, what we're talking about is a neurological syndrome called traumatic retrograde amnesia, which occurs after a person has suffered a concussive blow to the head. That is, a head injury that has rendered the patient unconscious for a shorter or longer period of time. This is very common in the head injuries that we observe after automobile accidents, where somebody's not been wearing a seatbelt and has hit something, and his forehead has struck the dashboard or the windshield or whatever. These patients generally display what's known as a retrograde amnesia. They can't remember the things that happened to them in the moments or minutes prior to the head injury. And sometimes this amnesia can cover a more extensive period of time, going back hours or even days or weeks. But the point is that, like memory, the retrograde amnesia is itself temporally graded. The amnesia is densest, most severe, for events that occurred immediately before the head injury. The further back you go in time, the less amnesia there is, until you come to a point where the patient's memory is, for all intents and purposes, normal. And again, this is exactly what you'd expect if traumatic retrograde amnesia was caused by a kind of disruption of the consolidation process. The very recent memories have had less time to be consolidated, so they're more vulnerable to the amnesia. The more remote memories have had lots of time to be consolidated, and they're relatively invulnerable to the amnesic process. Here's a real-world example of the temporal gradient in retrograde amnesia from a study of depressed patients who are receiving electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, as a treatment for depression. Now, we don't need to get into all the details about how ECT works and all of that, but what happens in ECT is that the physicians will deliver a convulsive electrical current to the brain of the depressed patient. They put electrodes on the patient's temples, perhaps on one temple and at the vertex of the skull, generate the electrical current, and the electrical current causes a convulsive seizure very similar to what you would see in epilepsy. Now, ECT actually works as a treatment for depression, at least some forms of depression. We don't have a clear idea of how it works, but as an empirical matter, it does work, and if you do it right, it's very, very safe procedure. But it also has the same effect as a concussive head injury, which is that it renders the patients amnesic for a period of time that leads up to the moment that the ECT was delivered. In a pioneering study by Squire and Chase, depressed patients were asked to recall news events from various periods of time before their hospitalization. Some patients received a round of electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, before the test, others did not. The study was conducted in 1973. It's a classic study. What you can see here is that the patients who received the ECT had a lot of difficulty recalling events from the previous 1 or 2 years compared to patients that had not received the ECT. That's the traumatic retrograde amnesia induced by the treatment. But if you go back another couple of years to 1969, 1970, 1967, 1968, there's absolutely no difference between the ECT patients and those who did not receive ECT. So here again, the amnesia is temporally graded. It affects very recent memories more than more remote memories. And again, this is exactly the pattern of results we'd expect on the basis of the consolidation hypothesis. Now, unfortunately for the consolidation hypothesis, traumatic retrograde amnesia has another property, which is that patients recover from it. As time goes on, patients are able to remember some of the events that they had earlier forgotten. And again, this recovery of memory is temporally graded. Patients are more likely to recover memories for more remote events and less likely to recover memories for the most recent events. The result of this is that after a while, most patients who have suffered some initial amnesia after a traumatic head injury will recover most of those memories. They'll come back. And what the patient will be left with is what's called a final or residual amnesia that really affects only those events that occurred immediately before the head injury. Really, we're talking about the moments to minutes before the head injury. There may be some exceptions and the memory may be a little bit spotty, but when all is said and done, this final retrograde amnesia doesn't extend very far back in time. And so obviously the problem for consolidation theory is, if these more remote memories were lost to amnesia by virtue of some disruption of consolidation, where'd they come from? How'd they come back? If consolidation is disrupted, they should be gone forever, permanently forgotten. And apparently they're not. In fact, recent research suggests that there are 2 different kinds of consolidation processes at play here. First, there's a short-term consolidation process, which is essentially a byproduct of encoding and occurs within seconds of the event. Disruption of this short-term consolidation process is what's responsible for anterograde amnesia, as in the case of the amnesic patient HM. The long-term consolidation process persists for some period of time after the initial encoding has taken place. Minutes, hours, maybe days. And in fact, some recent research suggests that this long-term consolidation process is actually facilitated by sleep. In any event, it seems to be the disruption of this long-term consolidation process that's responsible for retrograde amnesia. Setting aside accidental impairments of the consolidation process, as in traumatic retrograde amnesia, certainly the primary source of time-dependent forgetting is what we now think of as interference. The general idea of interference is that once encoded, with perhaps a little extra time needed for consolidation, memory traces are permanently stored, and forgetting occurs by virtue of the mutual interference that occurs among accumulated memories. This leads to what is now known as the paradox of interference. It turns out that the more you know about a topic, the harder it is to retrieve any particular item of information about that topic. Although this may seem counterintuitive, it follows from the principle of interference and is convincingly demonstrated in studies that measure memory retrieval in terms of response latency rather than in accuracy of recall or recognition. Here's a classic demonstration of the paradox of interference by John Anderson, a psychologist at Carnegie Mellon University. Anderson had his subjects learn a list of simple facts about people and their locations, such as the doctor is in the bank, the fireman is in the park, the lawyer is in the church, and the lawyer is in the park. Note that there's only one fact about the doctor and only one fact about the bank, but there are two facts about the lawyer and two facts about the park. In this way, the experimenter varied the number of facts learned about each person and each location. The subjects memorized the list until they could recall it perfectly. And then they were given a recognition test in which they were asked to distinguish between targets that they had actually studied, like the doctor is in the bank, and similar sounding lures that were not on the study list, such as the doctor is in the park. The subjects rarely made a mistake on this kind of recognition test. After all, they had actually memorized each of these sentences. But their response latencies for both true and false facts varied according to the number of facts they had learned about each person and each location. If they knew only one fact about a target or about a location, they responded pretty quickly. But if they knew two facts or three facts, it took them correspondingly longer to respond. The effects may look small, but they're highly significant in this kind of research. The more the subjects knew, the more time it took for them to access any particular item of information. This effect in memory is known as the fan effect, and it is very, very robust. So now we're in a position to restate the time dependency principle in memory in a way that makes it a little bit less trivial sounding. Memory diminishes with time, that's right, but we now know that mostly memory diminishes with time by virtue of interference among competing memories. This interference comes in two forms. In retroactive interference, memories encoded later interfere with the retrieval of memories encoded earlier. The interference is retroactive, it works backwards in time. But there's also proactive interference, in which memories encoded earlier interfere with the retrieval of memories encoded later. The interference is proactive because it's working forward in time. All those memories are there in storage, earlier ones and later ones. And when it comes time to retrieve them, they get in each other's way. The idea that encoded, consolidated memories interfere with each other at the time of retrieval illustrates a fundamental distinction between the availability of a trace in memory storage and the accessibility of that trace during the retrieval process. Availability has to do with the existence of a trace in memory storage. Traces are available in memory by virtue of having been encoded, consolidated, and retained in storage. But not all memories available in storage are accessible at any particular time. Decay, consolidation failure, displacement are essentially effects on availability. Interference is an effect on accessibility. The role of interference indicates that long-term memory is essentially permanent. Once encoding has been accomplished, forgetting is largely a function of retrieval factors like interference. Just to restate, because it's very important, the point of the distinction between availability and accessibility is that encoded memories available in storage may not be accessible when retrieval is attempted. So now let's move on to try to understand what goes on during the retrieval process. So now let's assume that a trace has been adequately encoded during perception, there's been plenty of elaborative and organizational activity, and that it remains in storage, available in storage over some retention interval. It hasn't been lost through decay or displacement or some kind of consolidation failure. The question is, how do we gain access to information that's available in memory storage? How do we gain access to available memories? And the short version of the answer is that this is a matter of queue information contained in the query to memory. Whenever we try to remember something, we are essentially asking a question of our memories, and these queries serve as retrieval queues or reminders of the event in question. Remembering succeeds when the subject is able to add information from memory to information contained in the query in order to answer a question about some event in his or her past. So the focus of our interest at the retrieval stage is on the information supplied by various queries to memory. In experimental research on memory, we generally distinguish among three different kinds of memory tests: free recall, cued recall, and recognition. In free recall, the query specifies the context in which some event occurs, but provides no additional information, and then the subject has to retrieve the event without very much help. So, in the last lecture, I showed you a list of words, and if I simply asked you to recall the words that I showed you, that would be a test of free recall. I specify the time in which some event occurred, and by implication the place was at your computer, and then I ask you what happened. In cued recall, the query provides more cues about the memory that's been targeted by the question. The query describes the context, as in free recall, but also describes the general features of the memory that we're looking for, so that the subject has a lot more information about what he or she should retrieve. If I ask you what you did on your summer vacation, that's a test of free recall. But if I ask you whether you went to any national parks on your summer vacation, that would be a test of cued recall, because there'd be an additional cue that I'm interested in the national parks. Similarly, if I ask you what the words were on the list I showed you in the last lecture, that's free recall. But if I ask you if there were any color names on the list, that's cued recall, because the query has added information about the target memory. Finally, in recognition, the query contains an actual copy of the target memory itself. And for that reason, recognition cues are often called copy cues. It's not a literal copy, of course, but still it's a fairly complete representation of the memory that you're looking for. Instead of asking you if you went to any national parks on your summer vacation, I could ask you if you went to Yosemite or Yellowstone. Instead of asking you if there were any color names on the list of words, I could ask you whether one of the words was orange or purple. Notice that, in a sense, all recall is cued recall, except that in free recall the cues are not especially informative. I suppose the freest version of free recall would be a simple query: tell me everything you remember from your entire life, and I just hope that you remember that list of words. In some sense, recognition is also a variant on cued recall, in which the cues are a copy of the event being remembered. In free recall, the subject has to do all the work, and in recognition, most of the work is done for him. Therefore, it shouldn't be surprising to find that the three kinds of tests are differentially productive in terms of producing memory. The role of cues in retrieval is nicely illustrated by comparing the results of these memory tests. This was done in an experiment by Tulving and Watkins, where subjects studied a list of 5-letter words. On a test of free recall, where subjects were asked simply to remember the words that they had studied, subjects didn't remember very many of the words that they had studied, only about 20%. On a cued recall test, where subjects were given the first letter or the first couple of letters of the words, there was a lot more memory. Memory about doubled. And on a recognition test, where the subjects were given all 5 letters of the 5-letter word, plus some 5-letter words that they hadn't studied, memory tripled compared to the results of the free recall test. As a rule, recognition tests produce more memory than free recall tests, and cued recall tests are somewhere in between. There are some exceptions to this rule, but that's the general lay of the land, and we don't have to worry about the exceptions in this course. The comparison among free recall, cued recall, and recognition tests of memory illustrates the principle of cue-dependent memory, which simply states that memory for an event is a function of the amount of information supplied by the retrieval cue. If the cue supplies relatively little information, as in free recall, you're relatively unlikely to remember the event. But if the cue supplies a lot of information, as in cued recall or recognition, then you're much more likely to remember the target event. Memory is not trace dependent. It's not a matter of the trace. It's not a matter of encoding or storage or availability, at least not so far as long-term memory is concerned. Rather, memory is cue dependent. It's a matter of accessibility and retrieval. And the probability of successfully retrieving an item from memory depends on the information value of the retrieval cue. The more information contained in the cue, the more likely it is that retrieval will succeed. Memory is cue-dependent, not trace-dependent, but it turns out that there are interesting interactions between encoding and retrieval processes in memory. The most important of these is that retrieval cues can compensate for poor encoding. If an item has been subject to just shallow processing, not very much elaborative or organizational activity at the time of encoding, it's unlikely to be accessible on a test of free recall, but it may very well be accessible on a test of recognition, because the large amount of information contained in a recognition test can compensate for the fairly poor encoding received by the item at the outset. Similarly, an item that's been deeply encoded, subject to a lot of elaborative and organizational activity, can be retrieved even in the face of impoverished retrieval cues, even on a free recall test. So good retrieval conditions can compensate for poor encoding conditions, and good encoding conditions can compensate for poor retrieval conditions. Encoding sets the stage for retrieval. It sets the conditions under which retrieval will be successful. And in that way, encoding can constrain retrieval. They're not exactly independent processes. Consider the following cued recall test, and no fair looking back. On that last list of words I presented in the last lecture, was there a girl's or a woman's name on that list? Even if you don't remember any of the specific words, you're likely to say no, because you probably do remember that the list consisted of the names of articles of clothing, body parts, 4-footed animals, and colors. As it happens, there was a girl's name, Amber. Amber's a color, but it's also a girl's or a woman's first name. You may know of the Amber Alerts that occur when a child has been kidnapped. They're named after a girl named Amber who was a kidnap victim. So there was a girl's name on the list, but you just didn't think of it that way, probably. And the reason for that is, when I first presented you with the list, you encoded the word Amber as a color name, not as a person's name. If I had asked you whether there was a color name on the list, you probably would have said yes. And if I had asked you if the word was amber or sepia, you probably would have answered correctly as well. And that's the point. Both girl's name and color name are perfectly appropriate retrieval cues, but one is more effective than the other because in this instance the word amber was encoded as a color, not as a girl's name. How an item is encoded determines how it will be retrieved. If it's encoded as a color, it will be most easily retrieved as a color. If it's encoded as a girl's name, it'll be most easily retrieved as a girl's name. Considerations such as this lead us to the principle of encoding specificity in memory. The encoding specificity principle states that memory is best when the information processed at the time of retrieval matches the information processed at the time of encoding. Put another way, memory of an event is a function of the degree to which the cues present at the time of retrieval match or overlap with the cues present at the time of encoding. The encoding specificity principle is sometimes referred to as the principle of transfer appropriate processing. We don't have to go into that now, but if you do further reading in the research literature on memory, you'll see transfer appropriate processing crop up in lots of articles. Encoding specificity begins with the understanding that memory is a byproduct of perception, and how an event is perceived is going to determine how it will be remembered. Put another way, how an event is encoded, what is stored, is going to determine how it will be retrieved. Encoding specificity thus sets limits on cue dependency. The cue dependency principle says that retrieval is a function of the amount of information supplied by the retrieval cue. But encoding specificity makes it clear that the issue isn't necessarily the amount of information, but the type of information. You've got to have the right kind of information. Information that matches the way the item was encoded in memory in the first place. It's not the sheer quantity of information in the retrieval queue. The information has to be the right quality, the right kind as well. It has to match the information encoded as part of the memory trace at the outset. Encoding specificity explains one of the most fascinating phenomena of memory, which is known as state dependency. In state-dependent memory, memory is best when subjects' physiological states at the time of retrieval match their physiological states at the time of encoding. And in these kinds of experiments, physiological states are usually manipulated by means of the ingestion of psychoactive drugs. Drug state-dependent memory was originally documented by Donald Overton, a comparative psychologist doing animal work in the early 1960s. In his experiments, Overton would have rats run a maze in order to get food. Some of the rats learned the maze in their normal state. Other rats received a fairly large dose of barbiturate during their learning trials. So now imagine a case where the animals were trained to turn left in order to get food. If they turned right, they got nothing. Both groups of animals, the drugged and the non-drugged animals, learned to make the appropriate response. It took the drugged animals a little bit longer because the drug actually interferes with learning. Most psychoactive drugs do, but they all learned it. Then Overton allowed the drugs to wash out of the system of the drugged animals, and after the washout period, he put them back in the maze and tested their memory. Half of the animals who learned in the drug condition were drugged again, but the other half of the animals were not drugged. And half of the animals who learned in the non-drugged condition were drugged before the memory test, and the other half were undrugged. So drug state during encoding was crossed with drug state during retrieval. On the test, the animals who were never drugged at all, of course, performed best. They turned left just as they had learned to do. But those animals who learned under the drug, but were tested in the non-drugged state, performed randomly. They turned right or left, mostly by chance. The same thing happened with the animals that were not drugged during learning, but were drugged during testing. They too performed more or less randomly. But the animals who were drugged during learning and drugged during testing did what they were supposed to do. They generally turned left, as they had been trained to do. They didn't perform quite as well as the animals that were never drugged at all, because again, drugs like this impair both encoding and retrieval processes. But the important finding of the Overton experiments is that performance on the test depended on the match between the animal's physiological state at the time of learning and the animal's physiological state at the time of test. Performance was best when the two matched, when the state at retrieval was congruent with the state at encoding. Put another way, memory was best when the conditions of retrieval matched the conditions of encoding, and that's what the encoding specificity principle is all about. You can get the same kinds of effects with humans as you can with animals, at least the same qualitative effects. The magnitude of the effects is not the same, if for no other reason than you just can't give the kinds of doses of psychoactive drugs to humans as you can to animals. In any event, here's a nice demonstration of drug-dependent memory in children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, who were treated with the drug Ritalin. Ritalin is an amphetamine derivative, and so it stimulates the activity of the central nervous system, but it's known that Ritalin has paradoxical effects on cognition and behavior in kids with ADHD. For reasons that are not completely clear, it actually calms them down and helps them to focus. And now, Ritalin is a very common treatment for ADHD. In this experiment by Jim Swanson and Marcel Kinsborn, two Canadian psychologists, looked for evidence of drug state dependency in children who were taking Ritalin as a treatment for ADHD. Some children originally learned the list under the influence of Ritalin, and others did not. Then these two groups were divided and the conditions crossed for testing, so that half the kids in each group were tested after they had received a dose of Ritalin, and the others were tested after the Ritalin had washed out of their system. Again, this 2-by-2 design is typical in studies of state-dependent memory. Here, the measure of memory is the percentage of errors that the students made during relearning, so that a low score actually means better memory. And you can see in this graph a clear effect of state dependency. Children who had learned the list under the influence of the drug remembered the list better when they were also under the influence of the drug, compared to after the drug had been allowed to wash out of their systems. Similarly, children who had originally learned the list when they were not under the influence of the drug actually remembered the list better when they weren't drugged. The Ritalin impaired their memory for the list. So memory depended on the match between the drug state of the child at the time of learning and the drug state of that child at the time of test. These kinds of effects have been documented with a wide variety of psychoactive drugs. Some drugs, like anesthetic agents such as barbiturates or nitrous oxide, give very strong state dependency. Nicotine also gives strong state dependency. Marijuana and other hallucinogens also produces state-dependent memory, though not to quite the same degree. Interestingly, caffeine doesn't produce state-dependent memory, even though nicotine does. One hypothesis about this is that the college students who served as subjects in these kinds of experiments have so much caffeine in their systems that the little bit more added in the laboratory doesn't make any difference. But the major point is that there are these drug state-dependent memory effects that you can see in humans as well as in non-human animals. There's also a phenomenon of mood-dependent memory induced by changes in emotional state. Here the experimenters induced happy or sad moods in their subjects by means of playing different kinds of music. So some subjects studied a list of words while they were happy, and others studied the same list while they were sad. Then the groups were divided in half, the conditions were crossed, half the subjects were tested for their memory while they were happy, and the other half was tested while they were sad, and the result was that memory depended on the match between the subject's mood at the time of encoding and the subject's mood at the time of the retrieval test. Subjects who were happy on both encoding and retrieval remembered more than subjects who were happy during encoding but sad during test. Subjects who were sad during encoding remembered more if they were sad during retrieval than if they were happy during test. Memory depended on the congruence between the subject's mood at the time of encoding and his or her mood at the time of test. And there's also environment-dependent memory. In this study, a group of scuba divers studied a list of words either on land or 25 feet underwater. And the subjects were divided in half, and half of each group was tested either on land or back underwater. Memory was best if the environment at the time of test was the same as the environment at the time of study. Drug state dependency, emotional mood dependency, and environment context dependency are all variations on a single theme of context dependency in memory. Memory varies across internal contexts such as physiological state and emotional state, as well as across external contexts such as environmental setting. In each case, memory is best when the context present at the time of retrieval matches the context that was present at the time of encoding. Context dependency in memory is predicted by the encoding specificity principle, and it shows how encoding and retrieval factors work together to affect memory. Now, before we leave this topic, I need to say two things, and the first one is practical. If you study for your psychology test over a couple of beers, it doesn't follow from any of this that you should have a couple of beers before you come in and take your next midterm exam. Alcohol, like all psychoactive drugs, generally impairs cognitive functioning. It impairs both memory encoding and memory retrieval. So while it's true that if you're slightly intoxicated while encoding, you'll remember better later on if you're also slightly intoxicated, the fact is that you'll do much better if you're sober on both occasions. On a theoretical level, though, I want to point out that these context effects in memory are themselves cue-dependent. Almost without exception, evidence of drug state dependency, emotional state dependency, and environmental context dependency has been obtained with free recall tests of memory, tests where there are very impoverished retrieval cues to begin with. And when the information supplied by the retrieval cue is impoverished, then contextual matching can supply some advantage. But when the retrieval cues are more informative, as in the case of cued recall and especially recognition, matching of context provides no additional help. The effects of context, at least in the human case, are relatively weak, and they're easily overshadowed by other cue information contained in the query to memory. So if you study psychology in one environment and take your psychology exams in another environment, you're not really at a disadvantage, especially if the exams are multiple choice or fill in the blanks. So for purposes of these lectures, I've been treating encoding, storage, and retrieval as separate stages in the processing of memory, but it's clear by now, I think, that they're really not that separate. They are interdependent in particular ways. Encoding sets the stage for retrieval. How an item is encoded in memory is going to determine the easiest way for it to be retrieved. Effective retrieval processes recapitulate encoding processes. So when there's congruence between the conditions of encoding and the conditions of retrieval, that congruence facilitates matching with the trace, facilitates access to trace information available in memory. When the conditions of encoding are incongruent with the conditions of retrieval, that's bad for memory. There's a mismatch between cue information and trace information, and that yields forgetting as a failure to gain access to information that's available in memory.